Welcome to the Bridgehead with Jonathon Van Maren, bringing you cutting-edge news, commentary, and interviews from the front lines of the culture wars.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead on AM 530 at 1:30 p.m. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I'll be your host for the next half an hour. Now, last week we talked to Rebecca Kiesling, who's an attorney and a pro-life activist in the U.S., and she shared with us her very powerful story about being conceived in rape and how she uses her personal testimonies to sway people against supporting abortion in the case of rape. People as varied as Newt Gingrich and Rick Perry, all the way down to people she speaks to at high schools, and just making the very basic and fundamental point that human beings deserve human rights. We are valuable based on who and what we are, not how we came into existence. But when we look at both Canada and the United States, we find countries of people now who very rarely base their opinions on reason or fact. It's not very difficult to figure out that the preborn child inside the womb is in fact a human being. It's not too difficult to figure out that pornography is obviously damaging, and that if you expose yourself to pictures of thousands and thousands of naked people, it's unlikely that you're going to find yourself happy with one. It should seem obvious to people that divorce culture and hookup culture and promiscuity have done nothing but hurt children and hurt the people who are trying these relationships. And yet for some reason, we've been sort of tricked into thinking that this is normal, that this is the way that things should be, that this is just the way that societies naturally progress. So to kind of take a closer look at what it was that happened, that our culture started to buy into all these lies like abortion, lies like the sexual revolution, I called up a man named David Kupelian. He's an award-winning American journalist. He's a best-selling author, and he's the vice president and managing editor of the online news giant WND. He is a widely read online columnist, the editor and driving force behind Whistleblower magazine, and he's the author of two very influential books, 2005's The Marketing of Evil and its 2010 sequel, How Evil Works. Now, actually, The Marketing of Evil is a book that here at the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform I share with all of our interns so that they can get a background on, for example, how it was that abortion became mainstreamed, and how it was that something we know kills a human being turned into an issue of choice and not an issue of human rights. Kupelian is a frequent media guest. He appears on Fox, MSNBC, C-SPAN, CBN, and a lot of other TV and radio venues. And I was really grateful to him to make the time to come on and chat with me today to share with all of you the different ways in which evil has influenced our culture and the different ways in which evil has been sold to our culture. So without any further introduction, welcome to the program, David Kupelian.
So what I've been looking at on this show for the last while is how different things are sold to the public, and how we live in a very high information age with a lot of information available to people, and yet still for some reason a lot of the most significant issues have the least amount of rational thought actually put into them during discussion. So for example, the issue of abortion. You hear constantly things that are put out like, well, enormous numbers of back alley abortions took place prior to Roe v. Wade, or here in Canada that would be R.V. Morgentaler. So in your book, The Marketing of Evil, which I found very fascinating because it exposed, I think, a lot of things that people in our society just take for granted, you talk about how abortion was actually sold to the public with lies like this that are still repeated to this day.
That's right. Bernard Nathanson was the part of the vanguard of abortion legalization in America in the late 60s, early 70s. He was one of the co-founders of NARAL, one of the top unhinged pro-abortion groups even today, and he ran the largest abortion clinic certainly on the East Coast in Manhattan. He had a crisis of conscience. He was touched by God at some point, and he spent the rest of his life trying to put the genie back in the bottle of abortion, and he was very forthcoming about the marketing plan that they used to sell abortion to America and to the media and through the media to the public and the Supreme Court. And basically, he says they just simply fabricated lies. They flat out made up statistics. The number of women dying from illegal botched abortions, back alley coat hanger abortions, so-called, the number of women dying every year, they would fabricate by an order of magnitude, tenfold or more. They'd make up, or 50-fold. They make up astronomical numbers. Like it's in fact, if you go to the NARAL website today, you can still find the number of 5,000 to 10,000 women were dying every year of illegal botched abortions, according to the lying propaganda. There never was anything remotely like that. Nathanson, who was in the middle of this world, says it was something more like, I can't remember the number, it was in the hundreds, 100, 200, 300 per year, right. Not 5,000 or 10,000. 100 people dying of anything is a tragedy, but when you're going to legalize abortion and you do it on the basis of 5,000 to 10,000 women are dying every year, that is an aggregate number that makes people think, wow, if 10,000 women, Americans, are dying of anything, that needs to get our attention. We need to do something about that. And so that is how they sold abortion to a basically liberal, progressive media that thought that this was a good, enlightened thing to do. But the media, to their shame, never actually went and researched, trust but verify. They never actually said, okay, that's great. Where is your research? We want to double-check your statistics. You are an interested party. Who actually conducted this research? There was no research. They just made it up, as Nathanson later admitted.
Right, and on the topic of faulty research, one of the chapters of the book that I found most fascinating, because it contradicted virtually everything I learned when I was in university taking a degree in history, was your chapter on Alfred Kinsey. Because, of course, abortion, the legalization of abortion in 1973 was, of course, symptomatic to a degree of a culture that now needed abortion to deal with the sheer amount of unwanted pregnancies that were taking place due to promiscuity. But this whole sexual revolution was really brought about by one man, as you make that point, Alfred Kinsey, in 1956. And you point out that almost for everything we know about the sexual revolution isn't actually true.
Yeah, even, Kinsey is a famous person. He has been biographied several times. And even his most, positive biographers have pointed out the inescapable, that he was a very, very sick human being sexually. I think you could say he was a sexual psychopath.
Right.
The researcher that really brought all this to light is Judith Reisman. And what Judith, who is a good friend now, what she discovered is, she's been covering this for decades. She read, and this is right in the Sexual Behavior of the Human Male that was published in 1948, and it was followed by the Sexual Behavior of the Human Female in, I think, 1953. But the big blockbuster was the first book, 1948. This is still World War II Greatest Generation era time. Mm-hmm. And Kinsey was on the cover of Time magazine and everything else, and was like, he was the scientist in the white coat that was portrayed as the conservative family man who did all this research and found out all this stuff that we never realized about sex. But it turns out that he was a very sick person, and you don't have to take anybody's word for it. You can simply go to the book itself, and you will find these very now infamous tables. I think it was table 35 and table 36. These are charts that purport to show the, how do I say this without sounding too graphic, the sexual responses of infants. We are talking not even just toddlers, infants, children down to 2 months of age. They were sexually torturing, and I'm saying if you are molesting children, and by Kinsey's own words, they were crying, they were writhing in pain, and so forth. I mean, it's unthinkable. It's like listening to the news today of what ISIS does to Christian children in Iraq and stuff like that. Things that are so horrible, you almost it's painful to even talk about them, okay? These are the things that are described in Kinsey's book. This book is an international bestseller, reviewed by all the international media. And so Judith Reisman, the scholar, says, excuse me, how is it that these tables in here, where we're talking hundreds of children are being molested like this by pedophiles with stopwatches, and they are literally transcribing the so-called, sexual pleasure, sexual responses of these little tiny children. And so Judith asked the obvious question that anybody who's thinking clearly would ask: what kind of research is this? It is a felony to have this kind of contact with little children under any circumstances whatsoever.
Right.
There are no exceptions. So how could this happen? And it's all laid out there. It's as though the world is in a trance. And the truth is that back then, even though, the West was more of the Judeo-Christian worldview, and we didn't have, same-sex marriage and even the sexual revolution yet, although Kinsey was the founder, the leader of the sexual revolution that flowered in the 1960s, and today we have sexual anarchy and the sexual revolution and gay rights and transgender, and it just goes on and on and on. But back then, it was something brand new. People, even back then, were kind of in awe of science. As long as the guy had a white coat on, and he was a scientist tenured at the University of Indiana, and the media, of course, would embellish and play on this thing, and he was just the family man, and how his wife. They'd interview his wife, and she'd say yes, and he enjoys the persimmon pudding, and they'd fill out all these details to show that he was just a regular guy who went where the research led him, and it took him. And the thing is that we all of us, being sort of fallen beings, if I can strike a religious tone there, we all have a part of us that kind of is excited by what he's saying. What he basically was saying in these books is that human beings are animals, and like animals, they should be able to have sex whenever and with whomever, of whatever gender, whenever they want. And he was practicing what he preached. He made all kinds of pornographic movies in his attic, and he pressured all of his co-workers and their spouses to participate in all this. He's a nasty guy. Okay, this is all been well documented. As I say, his life is kind of an open book, except that there's look. You might listen to this guy on the radio talking right now and say, well, if this is that bad, how come I haven't heard of it? Because the entire sexual revolution, the gay rights revolution, which is almost like the heroic class in Western culture now, okay, and abortion, which is all based on this idea that sex is a right to have. Sex causes children. Okay,
right.
But you want to have your free sex. You don't want the children, so you got to just right to kill the children. So much of the edifice of modern society, culturally and legally, is based on the grotesquely bogus research that this man did. And I'm not just saying that Kinsey was I won't say he was a pedophile. I don't know that. He certainly encouraged and enabled a great deal of pedophilia. Okay,
right.
But he's a guy who opened Pandora's box and allowed all this. So even though the details of his life are horrible, the fact that he went and he would research, and who would talk to, back in 1948, who would answer 300 sexually explicit questions? Okay, a lot of people, most decent people today wouldn't, but back in 1948,
right.
World War II era. Yeah, the people who did, they were prisoners, they were prostitutes. This is a fact. He actually went in and he interviewed lots of sexual offenders in prison, prostitutes, and so forth, and he labeled them as though they were, normal middle-class American housewives. This is outright fraud. This goes way beyond bias, and he had a researcher's bias. He wanted the research to come out this way. This is outright fraud. It's probably the worst junk science of the last century. Okay, but still, you say, "Wow, if that's true, why haven't I heard it?" Because so much of what people cherish and is so important to them today is rooted at its very, very base, in the root of it, in this fraudulent research. So that's why the Kinsey and his memory and his work is still protected today, even though, as I say, it makes global warming look like the most solid science ever.
Right. So what we have is the sexual revolution that was brought in, with Kinsey's research and slogans such as "Make Love Not War," and then the legalization of abortion in 1973, which proved they were very, very willing to make both love and war, and that although there were not things they would die for, there were things that they would kill for, such as the right to have sex unimpeded by the presence of children that would naturally proceed from those unions. But one of the things that I find is, as I debate on university campuses quite often with people, and it's very hard to combat the sheer volume of information that they're absorbing that tells them things, snippets, you know what I mean? If you have social media, you'll see major sites like Mick.com and Upworthy and all of these different sites that are churning out probably 3 or 4 a day sometimes of so-called studies proving, for example, the ludicrous assumption that, pornography is healthy, talking about how maximizing your number of sexual partners will actually improve your life. Things that are patently false, even if you briefly think about them for longer than 15 minutes. One of the reasons that the cosmopolitan magazines and stuff like that have to have huge features on how to get over jealousy is because when you're comparing yourself with the 12 previous partners Cosmo told you to have, jealousy is going to naturally just erupt. But we've kind of abandoned, reasonably thinking about these things, and we've abandoned intuition, and we've abandoned reason in favor of these really short junk science articles that people just sort of swallow whole. And how do we combat this type of thing?
Well, you're quite right that the whole intelligentsia, there's an enormous amount of quote peer-reviewed research that's junk that is being conducted, because that is the coin of the realm now. Okay, well, this is what constitutes expert opinion, and so you have as I say, you have junk science that is done from the get-go by totally biased researchers that set out to prove something, and then they do it. And as you know, the devil's in the details in the way that the research is set up. But here's part of the problem with, you say, what can we do to counteract that? Part of the problem is not just the worldview and the philosophy that is inculcated in people. We talk about young people going to college, as you mentioned, college. Okay, so we have the idea that people go to college and they have some unhinged Marxist professor is unloading his worldview into them and intimidating them into accepting it and to playing it back to them. And if they don't, they're going to fail and they won't be able to go and graduate and so forth. That's true, but I don't actually think that is the biggest part of it, because let's just say you go to college and when you go, you're a fairly decent, moral, common sense person. Now you go and you're in this totally artificial environment of hundreds or thousands of largely unsupervised young people, all under pressure, and it's extremely progressive, liberal environment. Unless it's like an overtly Christian college or something. For the most part, that's what college is today.
Right.
And let's just say that it's nothing more than that you get drawn into crossing a moral line and becoming immoral sexually. You start shacking up with somebody. Okay, that's all it is. You don't have any Marxist professors. You haven't been pressured into believing this or that. What happens? Because the thing is that we forget God is real. There really is good and evil in the world, and they both are recruiting us. They both want us. Okay, and so you go to college and you get sucked into crossing this moral line, and now you're living in sin, if I can use the old Christian expression. Okay,
right.
What happens to your worldview? Now your parents are kind of your enemy, okay, because you're Christian parents. You got to hide this from them, everything that you used to agree with is now kind of suspect, okay? And the people that you used to when you were younger look at as, wow, it's really sad that they got drawn into that lifestyle. Now you're somehow sort of more enlightened. You see their point of view, and it's actually pretty good. And now you're more mature and you get it. Your brain's been twisted around. So if you are on the wrong, let's say that you're a heterosexual in college and you're shacking up with a girl. Now, you look at all the gay rights people. They are on the same side of that moral line as you are, or you are as they are. Who are you to throw stones? You know, you're living in a glass house now. So if anything, you're going to sympathize with them. And so simply getting drawn over into abandoning your principles, getting tempted is the religious word for it. That is enough to change the polarity of your entire worldview. And so you look at it now pretty soon, you used to be sort of more, conservative-minded in your instincts and your politics. Now you're more liberal because you are on this side where, well, yeah, I sympathize with these gay guys. They're just doing, I have more in common with them than I do with these Christians. Or let's say that you've had an abortion. You're a woman and you're there and you get pregnant and you get pressured and into having an abortion. And let's say that you are not really ready to face up to what you did. Okay, and nobody's condemning anybody here. Okay, but the fact is, life is full of suffering, and you have to face what you've done. Otherwise, you end up an addict somewhere. You're totally steeped in unreality, and everything has to do with escape and distraction. Okay, so that's a person who is going to suddenly be very afraid of and intimidated by and offended by the pro-life demonstrators out there holding the signs up. And these may be like sweet Catholic people there that don't have a mean bone in their body and are not condemning you, but you look at them as they are the meanest, most vilest human beings there, because you have somehow you've put out the light inside yourself, and when that light shines in somebody else, and it's unwelcome in you at this point, it burns. And it's kind of a spiritual thing we're talking about. But that's really what's going on there. It's not just, well, yes, the professor said this, and I've seen the logic of him that it does make sense to have like 1,000 sex partners. That this is an insanity. Okay, but these are people. These Marxist professors have long ago been compromised and given over their souls to the dark. You mentioned "make love, not war." That expression came from Herbert Marcuse, the famous, he's basically a dirty old Marxist, okay? He was one of the Frankfurt School. He's the guy who made up that expression. And so how many of the hippies in the I'm talking about myself. I was in college during the 1960s. How many of the people that grew their hair long were having sex with anything that moved and saying, make love, not war, and thought they were so enlightened, really knew that they were just reflecting the obscene worldview of a 1920s era, dirty old, really filthy, if you know anything about him, Marxist revolutionary.
Right. Well, and what you say here is quite interesting insofar as that you're making the case that it's not just education, it's not just the influx of information people are exposed to, but that when people sort of join in these actions themselves, they lose the moral credibility to speak out, and thus eventually lose the character. So playing into that, there's an interesting statistic that came out earlier this year then that over 50% of Christian pastors have admitted to looking at pornography in the last 4 weeks. Do you think perhaps then that the deafening silence of churches across the board on many of these issues plays into that loss of moral credibility where, if Christian pastors are struggling with, looking at some very dark and very depraved things, behind closed doors on their laptops, that they might feel too hypocritical or too ashamed to speak out on the issues that we need them to speak out about when they're in the light of day behind the pulpit?
Well, yes, that would be very logical that they would be embarrassed and the hypocrisy that they would feel would be unbearable to be lecturing. I suppose some are capable of doing it. We've seen some high-profile examples of Christian televangelists and stuff in past decades. But basically, yes. I would say I consider myself a Christian believer, but I, for the U.S., okay, the lower 48 here, where you've got 80%, maybe it's down to 75% of the population self-identifies as Christian. Okay, well, look at the kind of government and culture and laws and public servants we have. They're more and more not just unchristian, but anti-Christian. So the pulpit is not very effective right now. And the fact that, look, when you say 50% of pastors confess to looking at pornography, this is one of the really big scourges. I'm not dumping on the pastors here.
Mm-hmm.
And in past times, if you wanted to look at pornography, you had to either order it through the mail, or go to the airport newsstand or whatever, and buy your whatever Hustler magazine, or you had to go to one of these raunchy adult bookstores, and there was really plenty of time along the way for your conscience to say to you, "Stupid, what are you doing?"
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but in the age of the internet, where it is literally like the transporter machine in Star Trek, okay, if you have a passing dark thought, a pull to go and look at whatever it is that the thought that perches in your mind there, you can be there in 3 seconds. Okay, so you can literally beam yourself into pornographic quicksand in no time and bypass the conscience factor that if you had to get in your car and drive out there, you'd say, "What the hell am I doing? Why am I doing this?"
Mm-hmm.
You probably wouldn't get out of your driveway. Okay, so that is part. Look, I'm an internet journalist. Okay, the internet is a almost magical technology. It's amazing, but it is leveraged by evil and by good. It's like all technology. It's amoral. It's used for good and evil. And believe me, we better use it for good, because evil is really using it, telling people how to make bombs that get past metal detectors. That's in the news today. That's why we have higher, security status at the airports, and of course, pornography and all the rest. So we may as well use it as instrument of enlightenment as well, because evil is sure using it.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Happy to talk to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was author and commentator David Kupelian, author of The Marketing of Evil, sharing with us how evil has influenced our culture in different ways and how it has disguised itself to gain widespread acceptance in the public. In fact, he mentioned Dr. Judith Reisman several times. We've actually interviewed Dr. Judith Reisman right here on this program, and if you want to listen to that interview and a lot of other ones, please go to our YouTube page, the Bridgehead YouTube page, and all of our interviews get posted there shortly afterwards. We hope you enjoyed this interview, and we've got a whole bunch of exciting interviews coming up over the next several weeks. We've got a number of different series looking at different issues in human rights, and we hope you'll consider joining us again next week at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on AM 530. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.